The Single Tracks podcast is brought to you by TPC, the Pros Closet. Spring is the perfect time to upgrade, and TPC has an industry-leading selection of new and certified pre-owned bikes, plus frames, wheels, and accessories. Each certified pre-owned bike is inspected, tested, and serviced, and every bike includes 30-day returns. Visit tpc.bike/singletracks and enter code singletracks40 to save $40 on every order over $200. That's the Pros Closet at tpc.bike/singletracks, and look for the link and coupon code in the show notes. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Goat. In 2006, Goat and two friends set out to ride mountain bikes from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, the southernmost tip of South America. And after 3.5 years of travel, the trio completed the mother of all bikepacking trips. Riding the Spine is just one of the many adventures Goat has experienced over the years, including living in a treehouse and building and working on countless bikes. Thanks for joining me, Goat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you moved around a good bit and traveled with your family when you were growing up. So was it like natural for you to continue into that lifestyle into adulthood?
Absolutely. You know, both my parents are adventurers. My grandfather was an ambassador. My mother was a big wall climber, and my father's a pioneering whitewater rafter. You know, he's done more first descents than anyone else in the world. All over the world.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I grew up rock climbing and rafting and traveling quite a lot. Family lived traveling for a couple of years in Mexico and around the U.S., climbing the highest peak in every state. So yeah, I mean, my upbringing absolutely kind of pushed me towards the lifestyle I still have, or at least made it make a lot of sense. In fact,
Yeah. I mean, I could see it going both ways, though, right? Like, you know, a lot of kids, they want to do the opposite of what their parents do. They want to rebel.
That's true.
So, like, did you have siblings that, chose a different path? They're like, no, I'm going to get a 9-to-5. I'm going to live in the same place and get a house in the suburbs.
Yeah. You know, I have two siblings, and the youngest, my sister, has always been a little bit more on that tip. In fact, when we were all in high school, she was the only person in my family who had a real job, and we like to laugh about that. But yeah, and you know, she has a master's degree in the family, and it works for UCSF. And yeah, my brother is also a little more settled down, but both of them are still world travelers and adventure, nature lovers and whatnot. So didn't fall that far from the tree, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, did you ever consider that path? Because I thought I read that you had a master's degree too.
I do. I have a master's degree in education. I was a high school history teacher for about a year.
Oh, interesting.
And I loved college. I had a great experience there. But yeah, teaching public high school was definitely not for me then, and it probably still isn't for me.
Yeah. I'm sure you'd be everybody's favorite teacher, though. You got stories for days.
Yeah, you know, my students did enjoy having me as a teacher, and I feel like I was probably pretty good at it. But yeah, it was just the structural problems of the way public school works was just really hard on me, and I think it's really hard on students as well. Just not set up well.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, when I left to go on the Riding the Spine trip after my master's and whatnot, my dad said to me, "Finally, it's about time. You've been wasting way too much time in college."
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, such validation.
Totally.
Well, I mean, so this kind of brings to mind, I was reading that you were in the Boy Scouts, and you know, scouting is a pretty traditional conformist activity, but from reading about your experience, it sounds like you felt really empowered to take things in a different direction in your troop. Tell us a little bit about that. How, as a young person, how did you feel so empowered to really make scouting your own thing?
Yeah, it was a funny collision of opportunity or like vacuum of leadership, and then I'd say like all of my or a large part of my self-confidence and being able to choose my kind of unusual path comes down to my super supportive parents and upbringing. But yeah, first of all, the scouting thing. I grew up in a pretty small town up in the Sierra foothills, California, and both the Mormon church and the Congregational church wanted to sponsor Boy Scout troops, but there weren't enough boys, so they had to share one. And our and our troop actually had two different numbers, so it was technically two different troops. Mm-hmm. And you'd think that would mean there would be like extra leaders or like adults who are interested in leadership roles. But for whatever reason, there just weren't. Mm-hmm. And the Mormon church would like basically appoint somebody as scoutmaster, like, you must do this. And and they would do it, but they do it for like as little time as possible. Or at least that's how it seemed to me. And so with the like adult leadership fully checked out, somebody had to like make sure things happened, and it turned out to be me.
Mm-hmm. And how old were you when you realized this, and when you were like, okay, it's up to me, I'm going to do it?
It's a good question. This is like junior high school. I was senior patrol leader, which is like, the kid who has the most responsibility in the Boy Scouting world for a long time. Like normally you do that for like a year or something, and I did it for like 5. Mm-hmm. And
there's no term limits, apparently.
No term limits. You're not really voted. But yeah, so I was just in charge kind of. And so we did a lot less like authoritarian military practice, which is kind of what Boy Scouts lends itself towards. And we're a lot less worried about.
Yeah. Wearing uniforms, like, all that stuff. That was my least favorite part. Like when I was in it, I hated wearing a uniform, but yeah, like there was also cool stuff. Like you got to go camping and do adventurous stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, we like didn't really force much uniform wearing and weren't very concerned about it, and did lots of like rock climbing and rappelling and backpacking, rafting, all that kind of stuff. And we actually like modified the uniform to be a little more fun, and our official shirts and neckerchiefs were tie-dyed, and I kind of
cool.
We would always get in trouble at camp for wearing sandals. They were like, like scruffy outlaw Boy Scout troop.
So how did you get into cycling, and particularly long distance cycling?
It's kind of tied to the Boy Scouts. I was always into bikes because it's a human-powered mode of transport. And I even, back then in like middle school or whatever, felt like we, especially in the U.S. where I'm from, overuse the automobile, especially like as a personal form of transportation, like just one person driving these huge things around. And I was interested in like less insane modes of transport. So I did a lot of walking and hitchhiking as a kid. It's interesting growing up in a super rural area where most people are like getting their learner's permit at 14 because you can if you live in a rural area, and like driving is like this great freedom, like, oh, I can do my own thing now. And that's like basically all of my peers' experience. And for whatever reason, I didn't feel that way about it. I never felt all that constrained. I would just walk somewhere, even if it took me 3 or 4 hours.
That's true. You don't need a license to walk or to ride a bike.
Exactly. And so so that's how I started dabbling in bikes, but I didn't really have a bike that was any good. Like you can ride any bike, you can ride really far on any bike, but there's like levels of quality and setup and stuff that make a bike a lot better or conducive to that. And so the reason I walked mostly is that I had like just a single speed coaster brake not BMX, but like kind of cruisery thing for most of my childhood. And it just wasn't conducive to riding like in the mountains where I lived. But somewhere in there, a friend of the family gave me like a hand-me-down real mountain bike. I mean, it was, you know, rigid and whatnot. Because this was, you know, in the early 80s sometime. So, or early 90s, I don't know, somewhere in there. And I started riding that more. And I guess that coincided with my Boy Scout era, and decided to do the like like bicycling merit badge. Cause you know how Boy Scouts work. They want you to do these different activities and prove your competency in them. And you kind of collect those, and turns into like rank advancement or whatever. And I am an Eagle Scout, which is like the highest rank you can get in Boy Scouts. So you have to do a bunch of different things, which I think is like, the idea of it's cool. Like, expose yourself to different stuff, you know, cooking, bicycling, orienteering, whatever it is. The way they do it, I don't love, especially from my lens as like an educator. But anyway, that's beside the point. It's just a little too rigid. But I guess Boy Scouts is kind of a rigid organization. Yeah.
Well, it has changed at least, right? Like while we're on the topic of it, I mean, they've opened it up to more people. And,
they have.
Yeah. So it is cool to see that it can evolve.
I know. I'm curious. I don't have kids, and I'm not really around any kids of that age, but I would be curious to talk to folks who are doing that now and see how different that experience is and how much it has and hasn't changed. And the final for that is you can choose to do like 100-mile bike ride in 1 or 2 days, and decided to do it in 2 days. And I made like bicycle panniers for myself and several other people to be able to do it with me out of like scavenged sailcloth. And and it turned out to be the route I chose turned out to be really hilly and kind of an epic. It rained, all that kind of stuff. And I think everyone else who did it was turned off by the experience to some extent. And I was like, yeah, this is my thing. So in high school, I did a little bike tour around Hawaii with friends. It was his idea to go to Hawaii and the route and stuff, but I'm pretty sure that's the only bike tour he's ever done. But that was my first, time doing it in a place I didn't know, and the like exploratory aspect of it, riding on black sand beaches and, meeting interesting people. And that, just added a different layer to it for me, like the exploratory, improvisatory nature of bike touring, especially long distance bike touring. I mean, that was only a week trip, but, it was enough to see what it can be.
Yeah. Yeah. So I promise we're going to get to talking about riding the spine, but I have one more question, because I feel like all of this like sort of just leads up to this trip and like the how and the why and all of that. But I read that you lived in a treehouse for 4 years.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I'm thinking, why not? I mean, that would be awesome. But I'm also wondering, like, how does that even work?
Oh, yeah. So I went to school for 6 years in Santa Cruz, UCSC. And Santa Cruz is like, it's a beach town, but it's forest right up to the beach. It's like a little bit unusual in that. And so there's this big redwood forest that overlooks the coast. And the school itself is like up the hill from the town and the ocean in that redwood forest. And I actually chose the school 100% because of that. I went and like looked at different schools, and it was the only one that I felt like, hey, I could stand to be here for 4 or 5 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's because of the forest, which is incredible. And the school is kind of like scattered through these meadow and redwood forests. So you like literally walk trails between the different buildings to your classes and all. And they want you to live in the dorms first year. And I did that. And then kind of like, okay, well, it's really expensive to live in this town, and I'm paying my own way through school, and I got to figure out a better line for that, because I don't really want to go into debt. And there was a lot of lore in Santa Cruz about people living in tree houses, and there are like tree houses around, various like fallen apart ones out in the woods. And Jacob and I, actually, Jacob of Riding the Spine, we were roommates in college. That's kind of an interesting story in itself. But in any case, we decided to build a treehouse. And so we did. We went out, we built a treehouse, immediately got busted. We chose a bad spot. We never even slept in it. And
oh, man.
Tore it down and moved into somebody's backyard for a few months in a tent. But while we worked on a new treehouse, and we chose better the second time. Built a treehouse, lived in it for the next four something years.
Wow! Like, how big is this thing? Was it like insulated? Like, how elaborate was it?
Oh yeah, so all the tree houses I built, I ended up building about 5 in Santa Cruz. Were like really simple platforms, suspended or supported in redwood trees, because redwood trees, being tall columnar conifers, don't have branches you can use for support. So everything has to be either like hanging on cables or like have these cantilevered supports attached to the trunk. So they were all like pretty simple platforms, and with some kind of tent on them, basically. Like the one we lived in the most was a army mess tent, which is like a 2-story tent, or half of it's 2 stories. And yeah, super weird tent. I don't remember how I discovered them, but I was like, oh, that's obviously the right one, because we can have like a sleeping loft in that zone. And
yeah.
So it's a platform with an army tent on it. And then the third tree house I built for myself was a little more elaborate. It was 2 geodesic domes, each on its own octagonal platform, each around a separate fork of a forked redwood tree. And that one was about 120 feet in the air. The other ones were lower.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the one that I lived in for the longest was probably only like 20 feet off the ground. And yeah, it did eventually get found, and we had to take it down, and that's why I built another one. And the reason we chose to like go so high was to hopefully avoid detection. We are always very careful about our trails and maintaining them to like be invisible. It turned out that it's better to take one trail very carefully and then intentionally keep it maintained than to try and take different routes, because you end up just, if you're living somewhere, you end up just like trampling a whole area of the forest and making it really clear that somebody goes there a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, the last one got discovered by a fire department helicopter doing a controlled burn in a state park nearby, or city park, whatever it is. And they told the UCSC police whose land it was on, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, one of them decided to use his 3-day weekend to find us off the clock. Has kind of a vendetta against tree houses for some reason. Anyway, they did. And yeah, I was actually out of the country, not out of the country, out of state at that time, riding freight trains around. And so I came home to my house and all my belongings being gone, which was kind of a bummer, but made it a little easier to leave for 4 years. So
yeah. Have you lived in a treehouse since? Like, what's your current living situation?
I don't currently live in a treehouse. I have built a number of tree houses since. That's kind of what I do for a living, or it's like part of what I do.
Oh, cool.
I'm a builder. If I could only build exotic tree houses, I probably would, but I also only want to work for clients that I like, and so I don't like seek out those jobs, because it's a difficult thing designing a tree house that doesn't damage a tree but meets the client's expectations of grandeur and fun and so on. And you just kind of have to have the right trees. But yeah, I built 5 tree houses in Nicaragua for this resort, a permaculture resort or something along those lines. That's how they bill it anyway. In San Juan del Sur, which is a Pacific surf town. But it's all like centered around tree houses I built at this point. And I built a really fancy apartment in a tree in California for the same guy who is involved with that project, which unfortunately burned a couple of years ago. But yeah, so I build tree houses, but I haven't built one for myself yet. I do have a piece of property I bought with a sweetheart in Santa Cruz, or near Santa Cruz, with the intention of building there, but I've run into neighbor-inspired red tape issues and haven't been able to do it.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about riding the spine.
All right.
How did the idea for this trip come about, and who was part of that group?
Yeah, so the idea started kind of after my little tour I talked about in Hawaii in high school. My other best friend at the time didn't go on that trip, but was inspired by it and was getting into mountain biking at the same time. And he read about the Great Divide Trail, which was relatively new at that point. I don't think it was even quite finished, definitely not in the state that it is today. And he was like, man, we really should do that. Like, that sounds super cool. And I was completely agreed, obviously. And so he was like, cool, well, let's do it. Like, once we graduate, because we were like seniors in high school at this point. And like, yeah, once we graduate, let's do it. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And then we didn't. And we went to college instead or something. I mean, not that it's only like 2 or 3 months, so we could have done it in between, but he wasn't actually into it, I think, or as into it as he wanted to dream about it, not actually do it, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say that's where most of us are.
Yeah.
Most of us see that and we're like, yeah, one day, but really we're not going to do it.
Yeah. Or, on that note, that's such a great like entry to like packing or whatever you want to call it. I highly recommend it to anyone who's listening. Like, it's not as hard as you imagine it might be. Like, it's such a good route to check out this kind of travel, because it's like really, it's super well mapped out. The riding is not technical, and there's support, like towns and bike shops, and like you can bail out to the road like all the time. So it's like as safe as like really epic riding in the mountains can be. So you should do it, or just like even a section of it. Like, just go. Don't think you need like the right bike or to prepare a whole bunch or whatever. Just like go check it out. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you qualified that, because I think like for most people, maybe a weekend, do like a section or something would be a good place to start.
Yeah, exactly. That's the perfect place to start.
But yeah.
And you really can do that on that route, choose a zone, do a weekend, do a week if you can pull it off, like it's great for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I went to college instead of riding, leaving to do that trip. And but while I was in college, I met Jacob, who ended up being a large part of riding the spine as well. Definitely my best friend, still a very good friend. And we lived in the dorm together, and then like treehouse together for the next like 5-something years. And then we went bicycle riding together for another 4 years or so. So I told him about this idea about the Great Divide Trail, and he was like, yeah, awesome, let's do it. But while we like waited to do it, for whatever reason, while we were focusing on school and stuff, the idea got bigger, because we were like, well, if they could put together, dirt route through the mountains across the U.S., like why wouldn't you start like in Canada? Canada's got that for sure. Follow those mountains. And then like, well, if you're going to start Canada, like go all the way, go up to Alaska, good excuse to check that part out. And then, so on and so forth. Like, why stop at these borders? They're artificial. The mountains go the whole way.
Right.
And, it's like the longest, it's not quite continuous, but it's really close to the continuous. And it's certainly the longest mountain chain in the world if you follow it the way we did.
Yeah.
And, because, there's just these crazy mountains all along the Pacific coast, basically. In any case, we were like, hey, let's ride those mountains the whole way. And so, and this time my friend was actually into it. Jacob was as inspired about the whole thing as I was. And so we actually did it.
Yeah.
And kind of just before we left, really close to leaving, like we'd thrown it out there to all of our friends, like, hey, come do this. And none of our close friends were like, yeah, we should do that. And I was kind of like, you guys are crazy. Like, that sounds really hard. But this friend...
And would take a really long time. I mean, that's a commitment, right?
It's a big commitment.
Was the idea always to do it like start to finish?
Yeah.
Or did you think maybe we'll do like, a little bit, take some time off? And
no, it was to do it start to finish. We didn't think it would take quite as long as it did. We did our marginal amount of research about people riding the Panamericana, which is, the highway route that is also like pretty much continuous, like Highway 1 in California, Oregon, whatever, goes all the way. It changes names a few times, but there's like a coastal highway that you can connect together. And people who do that do it in about a year and a half at like a reasonable pace. I think the record last time I checked was 8 months or something. But
oh wow,
that doesn't sound like fun to me. But to each their own. Like riding the highway in many of those places is probably great. But in a lot of places it kind of sucks too, because it's a main road and there's no shoulder and all of that. It's not the kind of touring I like to do. But anyway, that was a number we had in our head, like about 2 years.
Okay.
We didn't really reckon for how much harder and how much slower mountain touring is. We should have, but we'd never tried it before, so.
Yeah, you're like year and a half. We'll just add 6 months because we're off road.
Yeah, exactly. While we were gearing up for this trip, there's a lot of gear to create or figure out, try to decide what the right thing to ride in this kind of like unknown way was. Like we hadn't really heard of anybody else doing touring like this. And, the American Cycling Association is responsible for the Great Divide. They were at that point, and they probably still are, recommending that you ride that trail on a full suspension bike with a bob trailer, which is such a nightmare of a way to tour, in my opinion.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
And and totally unsuited for that route. Like there's absolutely no need for all of that on that route, especially in my opinion. But anyway, I saw that and was like, well, we're definitely not doing that. So what are we going to do? So we had the whole process of, gear planning, figuring out. Fortunately, I spent a very large percentage of my childhood backpacking, internationally traveling, doing like adventurous things. So it wasn't like a stretch to figure out what to bring and all that. It's mostly trying to figure out the bike gear that was relatively new, kind of like a scrappy, make it work kind of person, build it out of trash. And so it was a departure for me to buy new bike parts and think about the right part for the circumstance and because of longevity and everything else, and not just try and find something at the local bike co-op or pull it out of the garbage.
Yeah.
But I would say I did pretty well with that. Our bikes all survived. Well, the bikes I designed and built up lasted quite well, stood up to what we were up to. The third person who did...
Yeah. So when you say you built the bikes, like these are, you built a frame. I mean, you started with tubing and like built up your own frame for it?
So I designed a bike, and my friend who was building bikes at the time, his name was Traffic Cycles. This was in the like height of the fixed gear boom, when there was also a boom in small hand builders. He was one of those, and he was building fixed gear bikes. But I was like, hey, you're a bike builder, build me this bike that's really nothing like that. And he did. And that frame worked well. I still have it. We designed them to work with extra cycle like long tail frame extensions to carry gear.
Oh yeah.
So my bike, is designed in my mind to work well with one of those and be specific to it. So it like doesn't have rear brakes, for instance, and such like because the brakes are located with the wheel on the extra cycle. And but then I was the only one of the three of us who wanted to like build an entirely custom bike for myself. And so the other guys rode other bikes. We eventually settled on Surly Instigators as our like base frame with the extra cycle on the back.
Okay.
But a friend Sean, who was the third person who did the whole trip with us, who we didn't really know before the trip. He was a friend of my brother's more like we knew him, like an acquaintance. He was at parties or whatever. He was more a friend of my brother's than mine or Jacob's. Mm-hmm. And he was the only person who took our invitation to join. And it was very last minute. And we actually, when I arrived in Alaska, I wasn't totally sure whether he was going to show up or not. Mostly because I didn't know him, but also because we like flew at different times and so on.
Yeah.
But he was reticent to listen to my advice about bike parts. And so his bike was not set up the way I would have done it. And he had significantly more failures of significant parts. So I felt vindicated that I was choosing, my design sense was right.
Yeah. Yeah. Did it evolve? Like, did your bikes, yours and everybody's kind of evolve?
Yeah. Mine evolved a lot. Obviously my mind is kind of technical and gear design oriented. And so I'm constantly thinking about that kind of stuff. The other guys' bikes didn't evolve as much, but they did. I mean, for instance, Sean's bike, we just had to build him an entirely new bike because first he broke his fork in the first week of the trip. He broke his frame about a year in. He broke his seat post, whatever. Anyway, just like massive catastrophic failures. And so eventually he ended up on a big dummy, which is, the Surly with the built-in extra cycle, which at that point was pre-production because at that point I'd established a relationship with Surly. But that was about a year and a half into the trip. But yeah, he replaced his really broken, cobbled together bike with a big dummy that he then let me spec the parts for and build up. And then that bike lasted the rest of the trip for him with like no major failures, which is pretty good. And I switched about that same time to a fat bike, which at that point weren't really on the market either. Like that was when the Surly Pugsley was in pre-production. I think they were ready to go in production and they were like hyping it basically. There was this guy, I think his name was Jacob, who rode one with a special trailer across Australian desert, the Canning stock route. Be like, you can actually do this with this bike. Like, think of, the things you could do if you had one. I think it's the idea.
Yeah.
I heard about that trip when we were in the Rocky Mountains in the winter, pushing our bikes through the snow a whole lot. We'd switched to downhill tires because they were the only like wide knobby tires we could get at the time. Like tire science designs have changed a lot since then. So we were riding these like pretty crappy Chinese semi-slicks most of the time because they were the only like small tread tires you could get. Like touring bikepacking tires just didn't exist. And then we got the winter hit us in Montana, or it hit us in Canada, but hit us hard in Montana and Wyoming. And suddenly we were like camping in snow, biking in snow. And it was like -12, -15 at the worst. And our bikes just weren't really equipped for snow. So we tried these downhill tires, and that really didn't work. They just clogged up with snow and were heavy when we weren't on the snow. But while we were going through that adventure trying to figure out how to bike in the snow, I was reading about this guy riding the sand on Pugsley, and I was like, dude, those are the bikes we need, like fat tires. That's incredible. So Jacob contacted Surly, and they were like, well, yeah, we'd totally give you one Pugsley. And they're like, but there's three of us. And they were like, yeah, we have one to give. And, at that time, Surly and their parent company, QVP, were much smaller. And they were taking a huge leap of faith gamble on the fat bike thing. Like, because they had to develop so much like proprietary stuff to make that happen. So it was like a huge gamble on their part. So being a little bit in the bike industry now, I totally understand why they didn't have a bike to give me. But at that time we were kind of like, dude, why you being so stingy? What the fuck? But
we're freezing here in Wyoming. Right? I mean, that's crazy in and of itself, though, that you guys were out there and so dedicated, maybe stubborn is the word, to just be like, we're doing this, we're not stopping. Like,
yeah.
I mean, because you had to know too, I guess, that seasons don't matter. Like, there's no way to time that trip so that, like, you know, you're in the good places at the nice time of year.
That's it. When you take a trip that long, it's impossible. It's impossible to plan how long things are any part of it's going to take, but it's truly impossible to like make such a long trip line up with the seasons. You know, we tried a little bit, like we left in early summer from Alaska because we were like, this is going to be the longest, you know, like amount of time that is nice in the north. But, you know, like I say, we got snow while we were still in Canada in September or something like that. And then it hit us really hard by the time it was actual winter. And we were, of course, in the Rockies at that point. So serious elevation, serious weather. Yeah, I don't recall ever thinking that like we should stop though. Which I guess maybe seems a little odd in hindsight, but yeah, we were just that into it, or at least I was. Jacob too, I think. Sean had like serious misgivings the whole time, which is hard for me to understand.
For 4 years.
Yeah, and I mean, no, I don't want to like throw shade on him at all because he did this totally amazing trip with us and finished it together, and that's sweet, super cool. And he also seemed to have like misgivings about it and different like vision of the trip the whole time. So he really suffered and struggled more, I think, just because of the like mental mismatch with the trip and then the conditions, you know, like for whatever reason, I was better at snow biking than the other two guys, and Sean was the least good at snow biking. And so like one particularly memorable day where I actually almost died of frostbite and hypothermia, he ended up like 3 hours behind me because his brakes stopped working. Like they froze up and he couldn't get them unfrozen. And so he was just walking and crashing in the snow in the mountains by himself for the whole day. And I, of course, didn't realize that stuff. And I was ahead. Maybe it's because I grew up skiing and I felt like I was skiing my bike because I couldn't like control it in the normal fashion. But I was doing that and I was having a good time. And so I got way ahead of both him and Jacob. And so when it was like around time to stop, I stopped, you know, let them catch up. But I didn't assume they were like way behind because I'd been having a good day. And so I didn't take proper precautions with like layers and changing my clothes and stuff. And then it got dark suddenly, as it does in the winter, especially higher latitudes. And all of a sudden I was too cold. My core temperature dropped and I never got it back up. I ended up, like say, we built a big bonfire and I realized while I was sitting at the bonfire that I had hypothermia. And because of that, I could barely talk because that's one of the symptoms, and like communicate that to those guys. And anyway, my life was saved by water bladders, you know, like camelbacks full of hot water in my sleeping bag. I went to bed with all of my clothes on and put one of those that they boiled up for me, which took forever because it was so cold, in the foot of my sleeping bag. And that's what got my like temperature back up. But I still suffered pretty severe frostbite on my feet because I don't know if you've noticed from your perusal of the riding the spine, but I don't wear shoes. And I wasn't wearing shoes.
I missed that detail. Okay.
Yeah, so I
no shoes. So sandals.
No sandals. Barefoot. Like
barefoot on the pedals.
Yeah, I have special pedals that I designed while I was in college when I got into fixed gear bikes, as everyone did in that, you know, early 2000s era. It was just the done thing. I built a fixed gear mountain bike, which was not the done thing, I guess. But, you know, on a fixed gear bike, you really need your feet attached to the pedals. I mean, there are, of course, people who ride like BMX or downhill or flats and can control their bike that way. But I've never had pedal control like that. And for for braking and skipping and all the things you do on a fixed gear bike, especially if you're mountain biking it. I felt like I really needed my feet clipped in, as it were, but I didn't want to wear shoes. So I ended up cutting down some flip-flops that I got at the flea market and bolting them to some pedals. And it worked great. And that's what I ride on all of my bikes to this day. So it's like just the strap portion of some flip-flops.
And I'm guessing no sock either. I mean, if this is a flip-flop, there's no sock.
There's no sock. Well, in this like super cold winter time that I was talking about, I was wearing these like neoprene socks that are for like, they sell them to go in ski boots or like for rafting, but not like thick ones like you wear for surfing, not booties, but like a sock, but you know, made out of neoprene, so rubber. I was wearing those and I like cut out a toe slot so that I could wear them while I was biking, especially for the wind chill, really.
Okay. Yeah. But that kind of defeats the purpose. They're not waterproof or like windproof anymore if you have to cut a slot in them.
Oh, well, I sewed the slot back up. They're not really waterproof.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I made them. I don't know if you're familiar with like Japanese tabi, like the martial artist shoes or the Japanese carpenter shoes that have like a split toe, articulated toe or whatever. It's like that. So that the socks were sewed up there.
It's like a lobster claw,
exactly.
but for your feet.
Foot lobster claw. That's exactly what it was.
Okay.
And you know, neoprene isn't waterproof. It actually works in the rafting world, at least, by getting water. And same as a wetsuit, you get like water inside it, and it holds that little layer inside that actually acts as the warming and insulation.
Okay.
So the like sewn toe thing didn't really change that, and you know, the wind chill definitely worked for that. The real problem came when I wore the bottom of them out from walking on ice and rocks and stuff, and that's where I got my frostbite, was through those holes in my neoprene socks.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I got pretty serious frostbite. It's, you know, they have a rating system kind of like burns do, and 2nd degree frostbite, which is what I had fortunately, is you can grow the skin back. It isn't like permanent flesh loss and gangrene, which is what 3rd degree frostbite is. So I did get that skin flesh back on my feet, but in the meantime, frostbite is your blood literally freezing. And, you know, we're mostly water. As you know, when water freezes, it expands. So what happens is your blood freezes, it expands, turns into and bursts all of your blood vessels and capillaries and cells. You know, your cells are mostly water.
Yeah.
And then those little ice chunks are still trying to be circulated by your body, trying to pump blood. So they're just like billions of little knives cruising around, shredding everything that's left.
Ow.
So it's, pretty excruciating, at least once it unfreezes. And then you end up with these, they're kind of like blisters, huge blisters of shredded dead flesh. And I had those all over my the bottoms of my feet.
Painting a real picture.
Yeah, really pleasant. I recommend it highly. And but we were in the middle of nowhere. I, just barely survived through hypothermia, and we had to bike out. The other guys obviously had a rough, cold night too. I mean, it was -15 and we're snow camping. And we're like, we need to get out. I mean, we needed to get out. There's no two ways about it, but we were still pretty far from a road, and no one knew we were there, and blah, blah, blah. So I had to but I couldn't even get my feet into my pedals. And if I had, I couldn't have pedaled on these giant blister things. So I had to drain them all, which was pretty excruciating in and of itself. And then I had to ride on that kind of raw flesh. But we did make it out, obviously.
Oh my goodness. On a loaded bike too. I mean, this isn't you just hop on your cruiser bike.
Oh yeah. Our bikes are really heavy.
Yeah. Terrain and heavy bike, and yeah.
Yeah, we were carrying like really a lot of gear because, we had to have 4-season gear, and camping gear was better then than it had been, for the previous generation of bike adventurers in the 70s, but nothing like it is now. And so we were carrying, my bike weighed somewhere around 120 pounds,
Whoa.
sometimes a little more, depending on how much water we were trying to carry. So yeah, really heavy bike, and in the snow, on a bike that really isn't dialed for the snow. Yeah, some pretty rough riding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we made it out, and we took a little rest time in some random town in Colorado or somewhere in there, and I bought some like winter cycling boots through a bike shop. Like they didn't carry them maybe, and I had to talk them into special ordering them for me or something. I don't remember, but
mm-hmm.
I wore some like lake winter cycling boots for the next month or so to let my feet recover because I had to heal all that.
Jeez. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My goodness. So another thing that I remember hearing about at the time was that you guys got into trouble for riding bikes through the Grand Canyon. Is that right? Like what went down with that?
Oh yeah, that is right. Yeah. So that came almost immediately next in the story, really, after me the serious frostbite and all.
Yeah.
Because, well, we got bumped off the Great Divide Trail because of winter. We kind of called being able to ride the rest of the Great Divide in the winter after that section because it only got steeper and snowier. We were just getting into Colorado, which is, of course, the highest elevation, most technical part of that whole trail. Mm-hmm. So we rode Kokopelli Trail, which is from like Grand Junction, Colorado to Moab, Utah, something like that, which is a super cool trail. It was the hardest mountain biking we'd done on the trip thus far. So that was a little bit eye opening because, even though the snow is difficult and all, the Great Divide Trail isn't technical mountain biking. Like 95% of it is not technical mountain biking. And the sections that are short and you can just walk them if you want to.
Yeah.
The Kokopelli Trail is like, full on technical desert mountain biking the whole time, like nonstop. And most people who ride it don't really carry gear. Even today, there's like these hut systems or people that will like shuttle gear for you so that, you carry some like emergency gear and some water or whatever, but you're not carrying 4-season gear. So anyway,
yeah,
we did that trail, which again, super cool, highly recommended, and ended up in Arizona, and decided to ride the Arizona Trail, which was like pretty much brand new at that point, and it goes north to south through Arizona, and therefore crosses the Grand Canyon because the Grand Canyon runs east-west across Arizona. And
because it exists. It's there. Yeah, no way around it.
And there's only one spot like that you can cross the Grand Canyon on a trail without like swimming or a boat or something, and that's right in the Grand Canyon Park and Phantom Ranch, Bright Angel Trail. There's a bridge across the river, and that if you've ever gone hiking in the Grand Canyon, like that's where you went. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, you were at the south rim most likely, and that's where that trail starts. And so it's like the most visited and used part of the Grand Canyon. And in my opinion, that's why you're not allowed to bike on the trail. And it's pretty reasonable. Like if you tried to bike on that trail in the middle of summer when there's like literally thousands of tourists on the trail a day and mule trains, it would be a total disaster.
Yeah.
The trail is really, really narrow, really steep, and definitely not like IMBA approved or whatever. In any case, we were there in the winter and we had to ride something like 30 miles of snow on a closed road to get to the trail at all on the north rim. That's the like less visited side, and They just kind of close it in the winter. At least they did back then. It's higher too, more snow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, yeah, we biked that trail, rode in, and then, we knew we weren't supposed to bike there. So when we got to the bottom where Phantom Ranch is, where there are like year-round rangers, we like packed our bikes up because, people who are riding the Arizona Trail to this day are supposed to carry their bikes through, which is pretty wild, in my opinion. They like don't even want your wheels to touch the ground.
Right. I mean, don't you have to like disassemble you can't just, throw the bike over your shoulder. You have to take the wheels off.
Well, you could. I think technically if you wanted to throw it over your shoulder and hike for literally 2 days on really steep terrain, I don't think anyone would stop you. But the practicality of it is that if you're going to carry your bike there, you have to put it on your back somehow. You need some kind of pack. And we knew that. We knew there was no way we were going to be able to ride out of the Grand Canyon, especially because we rode in on the gentler trail. And the Bright Angel Trail, which is the one on the south rim, is just crazy steep. Like, there's absolutely no way you could ride a bike up it in, like, just no matter what. It's too steep and too loose. Too sharp. Switchbacks are too sharp. Like, I mean, maybe Danny McCaskill on an e-bike could ride it or something, but like, it's just not really rideable. So we knew we were going to have to carry our bikes out. And we also, remember, our bikes are long tails, and we're carrying a ton of gear. So we knew that we had to like have some way to get them on our backs or whatever. And so we actually bought frame, like old school backpacking backpacks at a thrift store in Arizona, and then took the bag part off of those. So we just had the frames. And so we were carrying those like strapped to the top of our long-tailed decks so that we could then strap our frames and gear to those and have a like relatively comfortable and supported way to carry our gear out. So when we got to the bottom in Phantom Ranch, we did that. We stashed our gear just behind a rock somewhere, and because we were also like, there's no way we're going to be able to hike out right now, and we don't have permits to camp down here, so we need to leave today. There's no way we're going to be able to hike out with 120-pound packs after like biking in this super difficult trail in the winter, hike up this super difficult trail that people like literally die on every year because they aren't up for it. That's mostly from heat exhaustion and heart attacks and stuff. Obviously, we were in really good shape. But anyway, we stashed our gear. We strapped our bikes to our backpack frames, and we hiked out. We made it a little after dark to the south rim, and we're like, okay, well, now what do we do? All our gear's at the bottom. So we stayed in an unfortunately expensive hotel because we didn't really have any other option there. Fortunately, because it was the winter, the hotel had room. Because if it had been the summer, it's booked out forever. So yeah, we spent the night in the hotel and hiked back down with just our empty backpack frames in the morning, which I think must have been a pretty funny sight for the few people that were also out hiking, because we were literally like running down that trail with just backpack frames and water bottles. And everyone else was like, it was a pretty serious endeavor what they were up to. So I think we must have been pretty perplexing. Anyway, we got to the bottom there, strapped the rest of our gear onto our backpack frames, hiked out, and went our merry way. And we were like, well, that's cool. We did see that one ranger in the bottom, but we were carrying our bikes by then, and they didn't seem too interested or concerned. And great, we rode the Grand Canyon. That was super cool. Yeah. And about a month and a half later, we were in Tucson. Is that right? No, we were even further south. We were like almost at the border. We went to this 24 hours of Old Pueblo bike race, and mostly because we'd met folks in Arizona on the way down who were going to be there. And we're like, hey, you should come hang out, maybe even race with us or whatever. And we were like, okay, that sounds like fun. So we were at this 24-hour race, and we were cruising around talking to people about being on their teams or whatever, because there's lots of different categories. And the one that most people race in is sort of an unlimited number of people on the team, but you take turns. And so we were looking for one of those that, wasn't like a seriously competitive team that were willing to let us randoms on there. And while we were doing that, this young couple approaches us with like cameras and like press badges or whatever, and they're like, "Hey, we're freelance reporters. We're looking for a story. We're checking out this bike race thing, 24-hour racing. It's kind of weird. You guys look interesting. Like, we've never seen bikes like that before. What are you up to? Can we like do an interview or whatever?" And so Sean had the right instinct. He said no, which surprised me because usually he was more of the more outgoing. He liked the publicity. But Jacob and I were like, yeah, sure, whatever. We always did interviews. We had tons of interviews with random small town places. Like, part of being on the road like that is you just talk to everybody. It's just the deal. Mm-hmm. So we said, yeah, sure, whatever. And they grouped us together, took a photograph, and then pulled out their Homeland Security badges and started reading us our rights. And
oh my goodness!
So it turns out that the newly developed Homeland Security Agency had spent a month and a half, and seems to be like a lot of wasted resources on hacking our email and tracking us to punish us for our egregious crime of bicycling in the Grand Canyon. And so they apprehended us just like about a week's ride from Mexico. And so, if we hadn't gone to this bike race, we never would have, gotten in trouble. But the Park Service, it turns out, was kind of on a kick of processing people for posting illegal activities on the fledgling social media. So right at the same time, Dean Potter, who is a famous free soloist, base jumper, rock climber, rock star, got busted for posting on MySpace, which was the big social media outlet at the time, that he free soloed the Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, which you're not allowed to climb on. And there were a couple other like reasonably high profile, but not quite as high profile as Dean Potter and us, people who were busted in the same way for writing on the internet about doing something illegal in the national parks. So anyway, we actually hadn't said that we rode, but we did post like pictures of camping off like in the middle of the trail in the snow in the Grand Canyon, and our bikes, of course. So somebody in the Park Service Internet Monitoring Division, whatever they are, had seen that and decided to go after us and enlisted Homeland Security. So seems super wild to me. But in any case, we went back to Flagstaff, went to court, went to jail, paid some really big fines, pled no contest to a bunch of federal misdemeanors, such crimes as camping in a non-designated area, trail use without a permit, serious stuff like that. And they're all federal misdemeanors that are still on record or whatever. Anyway, so we got, and that ignited kind of a firestorm of controversy. Like, we were pretty high profile for the time. Like, our blog was getting at the peak something like 1 million unique visitors a day. Now, of course,
oh my gosh,
that could well have been, that was primitive metrics. So that's like probably counting clicks or something, but we were like well known. And, basically anyone who had interest in the fledgling world of bike touring, bike packing, like, knew about us, and a ton of people were following our blogs. And
you were influencers. That's a term that is very common today, but back then that was kind of like a new thing.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
We were like bleeding edge internet influencers back when people still used blogs and, it wasn't a thing yet. So we were certainly that. And at that point, because of that, companies were like willing to give us stuff. Like Surly really helped us out a lot, in a really cool, no strings attached way that I don't know if it's still their MO, but we really appreciated it because they didn't tell us to like, rep Surly or put Surly anything. There was zero stipulations, just like, oh, you need gear? Here you go. So anyway, we were high profile, and so we kind of like seriously divided the bike community, especially in that part of the world. where there's a lot of like bike trail advocacy going on, because there's a lot of wilderness areas where you're not allowed to bike, and people are like, you should be able to bike here. And so trying to be like models of bike stewardship and all, which is something I totally support and is reasonable. But so those folks were like, shame on you, for illegal trail riding, basically. And some of those folks were like, you guys got off too easy with your like insane fines and jail time. Like it should have been worse. And anyway.
Wow.
And there's a like less vocal, I don't know whether it was a majority or minority of people who were like, this is ridiculous. Like, sure, give them a fine, but like this is over the top. Like they rode their bikes on a trail that gets like used by thousands of people a day in the summer.
I mean, it's clear they were trying to make an example.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's clear they're trying to make an example of you guys. And did you end up, I feel like I remember you guys ended up doing some like PSA type stuff, like writing about like,
oh yeah, we were required to,
why you shouldn't do that. And
yeah, it was really funny actually. So it was a federal court, which means there's no jury and just a judge. And the judge seemed more out to get us than the prosecuting attorney did, which was a very odd vibe. But he added, so we worked out a plea bargain with the prosecuting attorney because it was clear that we had no case unless we wanted to divide and conquer and throw each other under the bus, because Sean was the only person who there was actual evidence of doing these actions, like as posted on our website.
I see.
But like, obviously we weren't going to do that. Like, and we, could have had separate lawyers, and we were like, no, like we did this, whatever we're accused of, whatever we actually did together. We don't need multiple lawyers. We're not going to like try and get each other in trouble. Like, obviously not. That's just totally.
Yeah. That would cost more too. You got to pay 3 times the lawyers.
Oh yeah. It would have been expensive, but also just like morally repugnant. So in any case, we didn't do that. But, so there wasn't much that our lawyer, who was a mountain biker who was defending us pro bono, which was very kind of him. We actually met him at the bike race in the aftermath of being served this stuff. And, but so we worked out a plea bargain because it was clear that that was our only choice. And the only thing we were like really stipulated about our plea bargain was that our probation would allow us to leave the country, because federal probation normally does not. And we were like, there's absolutely no way we're going to agree to any agreement that doesn't let us leave the country, because we're going to leave the country in about a week for a long time. And
man, you guys are so dedicated to this.
Right?
That's amazing.
So yeah, they whatever, we worked out, dropped a couple of the charges, pled to these various crimes that I mentioned earlier, big fines, a little jail time, blah blah blah. But while we were like agreeing to that in court, the judge was like, wait, you have to add this. And he added a couple stipulations because we were influencers. But because it was also new, he didn't really know how to do it. He was obviously not very tech savvy. And basically they gave sort of contradictory requirements, which was we weren't allowed to talk about our alleged crimes in the Grand Canyon for a period of 5 years. But we were required to post about the consequences of our actions in the Grand Canyon.
We did a thing and we got punished for it, but that's all we can say.
Right. And we were also required to post a picture of us in front of the courthouse.
Okay.
So we did. But
did you have to have handcuffs on and like those prison stripes and stuff, or? We
didn't, but that's a funny story about that too. But we posted this picture. We took a picture, but we posted, like I say, they weren't very tech savvy. We posted like the tiniest pixelated thumbnail as a FU. Like there's no way you could tell what this picture is at all. But it was the picture they required us. And then we wrote a fairly sarcastic thing about us getting in trouble. But and then we turned ourselves in to serve our small amount of jail time. We like went out to eat with our lawyer and we're like, hey, thanks. I know he couldn't really do anything. That was very nice of you. And then we turned ourselves in for this like ridiculous crime, right? And they immediately put us in manacles. leg shackles, hand shackles, waist shackles,
gosh.
and escorted us to jail. Federal marshals with machine guns and us in manacles.
Whoa.
Look, we just turned ourselves in for illegal bicycling.
Wow.
What do you think we're gonna do? You know, it's not like you apprehended us after some crazy manhunt. You know, it's like we just checked ourselves in.
Yeah, been showing up to court every day. Yeah, we're right here.
Yeah, so we went in jail, and the federal prison folks who worked there were like, they were mad that we were there. They're like, this is such a waste of our time, but they were making light of it. And when they were booking us, they were like, wait, you guys bicycled in the Grand Canyon? Put them on suicide watch. And stuff like that. But anyway, yeah, we did our short bit of jail time, mostly with folks from the nearby Navajo reservation, because that, of course, is under federal authority. So even the smallest infraction on the reservation means you wind up in the federal pen. So,
oh wow,
that's an interesting cultural thing. Anyway, but yeah, and we got out and didn't really have the money to pay the fines that we were obligated to pay. But we'd met this guy at that same bike race who lived in Flagstaff, which is where the courthouse and jail and all were, who was a contractor, and he paid our fines, and then we worked them off doing, as laborers for him, which was very kind of him.
Oh, wow.
We actually lived at his house while we were working for him. And then we stayed there for a little while. Well, I stayed and worked for him because I'm actually a builder, and the other guys went other places. Sean went and drove buses in the Grand Canyon, of all places, which is...
You're allowed to drive buses, but not bicycles.
Well, technically he was not, because one of the stipulations of our probation was to not enter any national parks or lands for 5 years. But obviously they weren't checking the bus drivers. So he was driving tour buses into the Grand Canyon every day while I was doing, contractor menial labor, running wires at the top of lifts and stuff. In any case, we did that for a couple of months to build our savings, and then started biking again.
Wow, that's incredible. So we talked a lot about a couple of, I don't know if you would call them lowlights, but they're certainly kind of negative experiences. Like, what was your favorite part of the trip? Like, what stood out as like a highlight?
Sure. Well, part of the adventure touring, adventure of any kind, is that joking motto is that adventure happens when things go wrong. If things are going right, it's not really adventure. Kind of, it's a different thing. It's fun. It's light.
Yeah, you don't have
a
story.
It's not a story really. And so it's of course easier to talk about the things that went wrong. Those are the exciting and interesting stories. And as you might guess, I have lots more. But that's not why you do the trip. It's not to suffer and tell stories later. So some people see it that way, and I think maybe Sean did a little bit, at least when he got into the trip. He wanted to have a good story to tell, and he didn't maybe want to suffer quite as much as the good story required. But for me, the suffering and the setbacks were always like part and parcel, like part of the fun, part of what I was signing up for. And so these lowlights, as you put it, weren't. I mean, they were what they were. But the trip itself, of course, isn't about those things, and it's a different type of exploration. Seeing places you've never seen before in a way that potentially no one's ever seen it before. We were riding, we were following the mountains, but roads don't follow the mountains. Even trails don't follow the mountains. So we were trying to link these like totally unmarked, usually small trails together. And so back and forth across the mountains, heading vaguely south. And so we were doing a lot of like being lost was the truth of the matter. But if you don't have somewhere you're trying to go, you can't really be lost. But we certainly didn't know where we were. And the trails and roads we were on weren't generally on any maps of any sort. And people didn't generally know where they went. Even the people who lived there, if you asked them, beyond, the next little village or whatever, because their worldview didn't accommodate what we were up to. So we did a lot of dead reckoning and Rochambeau, rock, paper, scissors at intersections. That's how we would route find and just see what happened. But because of that, we ended up in a lot of very interesting and weird places. Met tons of little slices of rural Latin American life that you just can't see any other way except being way out in the middle of nowhere. And same goes for, the beauty of nature, incredible things when we were in Canada, for instance, we switched to riding at night for a while because we could then watch the northern lights while we were biking, even though we didn't have bike lights that were up to actually night biking. And the only way you could tell that the northern lights were happening is these weird reflections on someone else's helmet. But we learned to figure that out because of course they're silent and you have to look up. And while you're biking, especially on a rough road or whatever, you're not generally looking up. But when we would notice that they were happening, we'd stop and then we'd lay down in the middle of the road and watch the northern lights for a while.
Oh, cool.
And, experiences like that, or being in Alaska, for instance, camping, with no one for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles in all directions except us, and having a moose almost step on our tent in the morning, or surprising grizzly bear riding single track and having them run away down the single track in front of us, and the trail we were on was only there because it was a grizzly bear trail. It's the only reason we could fit down it with our bikes. That kind of thing. Frozen waterfalls in Utah, Arizona, the desert there. The desert in the winter is so, especially that part of the world, it's a pretty unique desert. It's just so stunning in the winter. It's actually even harder to ride in some ways than it is in the summer or shoulder seasons, because the trail where we were riding were washes and riverbeds and stuff, because there weren't trails exactly. And the routes we were following were off-road 4-wheel drive type trails, and those guys usually follow natural features because that's where you can, elsewhere the obstacles are just too great. So we were following some of those same routes for the same reason, but because they are washes and riverbeds, when there is precipitation and it's that cold, it's all frozen. So we were riding on ice for days at a time, of course, without having the benefit of studs or anything, and having heavy bikes that are kind of hard to steer. You have to steer them with your body a lot more than you do a shorter bike or an unloaded bike. So kind of more riding a chopper, I guess. A lot of body English required. So pretty tricky technical riding, but you're also riding a river of ice through this barren, inhospitable desert with ice waterfalls around you. And as things started to warm up, the desert comes alive with flowers for these brief instants, and it's such a magical thing. Or just the experience of following a road that, say, everyone tells you shouldn't go on, or that it doesn't go anywhere, but you've looked at a map and been that road doesn't go anywhere. It appears it dead ends in a blank spot on the map, but there's another trail not too far away that appears that goes to a town. And so, if you could find a topo map, which we would if we could, we usually had to go to the main city, seat of government in the country, and go to the military to try to get a map. But and they didn't always want to give you one. But that was the only source for a good map. So usually we didn't have one because that's halfway through a country or whatever. But when we did have one, we would look at the topo lines and be well, there doesn't appear to be a huge cliff there, so I bet we can get through. And so we'd ride up, we'd take that road, take that fork where, everyone would say, no hay paso. Oh, it's something we heard a whole lot. There's no way through. And Yeah, it turns out there was. Where there's a will, there's a way or something. And yeah, a little rock climbing with your bike on your back, or we did in Central America. We were there in the rainy season, and we spent a lot of time crossing active landslides with our bikes, which was pretty nerve-wracking, but also pretty cool. Rivers of mud and rock and trying to figure your way around it, where we made it, 3 or 4 miles in a whole day because we had to like separate our bikes and our gear so many times, hike back and forth through various fresh or active landslides, first with our bike and then with our gear, and then leapfrog again, because both our bikes and our gear were so heavy and the ground was so treacherous. But, you end up, after doing that, in this little village, and you end up living, like we spent the night after one of those particularly memorable ones in like this brand new rammed earth house built the traditional way, where you ram the earth with a big ass log and it takes the whole village to build you a house that wasn't quite finished yet. Or it was finished but not occupied yet. It had been built for, I guess the tradition there was you build a house when somebody gets married and they move into it. And so we were in somebody's house before they lived in it, but we stayed there and everybody came to visit, brought us, they would always bring, whatever their surplus was. Usually it was a little bit of milk and some eggs. That's something that people could like spare generally and would bring us as a gift, a welcome. Here, all the times that he got invited into people's homes where like people whose poverty is hard for an American anyway to even comprehend, just like so happily sharing what they did have without any consideration, just like so happy to welcome us into their reality and interact in whatever way we could, oftentimes without sharing that much language, because I speak pretty fluent Spanish at this point, and I spoke the best Spanish of the group before we started, but it wasn't great. And but a lot of these people we were interacting with didn't really speak Spanish either, because we were so far out of the city educated populated zones that people spoke their own Mayan indigenous dialects before they spoke Spanish. And Spanish was always like, second language, a lingua franca, the language you spoke when you went into town to sell your wares, and not really any other time. And so in a way that's good, because it's actually easier to speak in a shared second language than it is to speak a second language to someone it's their first language, because you both understand what it's like to not really know how to say something, to grope for words, to like speak in this kind of like babyish way. And so you're much more forgiving, used to like piecing things together, and then also you speak slower. So in a way it's easier to communicate, but it's also like quite frustrating. And you add the like extreme cultural difference of, like I say, people who barely been outside of this little village, they've gone to the next town, which is big to them and very small in the grand scheme of things. And that's it. That's the world they have experienced, and so even trying to explain what we were up to, just like people couldn't comprehend it because they didn't have a picture of how big the world is or where Chile is or anything like that, but if you told them you rode a bicycle from the nearest big town that they had heard of, that was mind blowing, because who would do that and how and why, right? But if you tell them what we were actually up to, it's just like blank looks. So always, interesting cultural experience, like trying to communicate both about what we were up to and like what our reality in the States was like. We spent a lot of time being cultural ambassadors of a sort, like trying to correct misconceptions, but also, give a window into there's a lot of different types of people in the U.S. And so what you see on TV isn't like actually normal maybe. And that, for instance, I'm from California, but I'm not blonde and I'm not a surfer, things like that. People are just,
Yeah. So cool. Yeah. So many great experiences. And I mean, it's hard for anybody, I'm sure, to imagine all the things that you and Jacob and Sean experienced and saw and learned. Do you have other like bike packing or cycling adventures in mind for the future, or is that something that you kind of want to leave in the past because you experienced so much? Like, what else is there?
Well, I mean, it's hard. It's a trip to be like hard to top or something, or even to match, you know, like it's pretty epic. And especially,
for sure. Yeah.
You know, as far as I know, we were the first people to do it. We're probably still the only people to have done exactly what we've done.
Yes.
Certainly the route, but I mean, even the like intention of the route, which is riding off road, primarily following the mountains, from tip top of Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. So, you know, I'm not like, and I'm obviously not 20 anymore. So I'm like, my sights aren't set that grandly, but, you know, but travel in general, bike touring in specific is still absolutely my passion, my love, and definitely still doing it. I'm not a very like future looking person. I don't have like big plans per se. It's kind of more like when something lines up, like, oh, this is the right thing. Here we go. But for instance, it's been some years now, but I got the opportunity to go to India to guide a rafting trip, but my compensation was plane tickets and being able to do the trip. And so I got a plane ticket to India, brought my bike, and that's about it. And made bikepacking gear in Ladakh in northern India, like cut up rafting dry bags and sewed them into frame bags and whatnot, and made a stove, blah blah blah, all the gear, and then bicycled across the foot of the Himalaya for about a year. Rode from west to east,
wow,
through the Himalaya, or at least the foothills of the Himalaya, on you know, yak trails and walking trails and whatnot. Yeah, all by myself, and dead reckoning, route finding.
Wow.
Often without a map, and certainly without language, because, well, Spanish doesn't serve at all in that part of the world, and the lingua franca there is Hindi, but people don't really speak it if they can avoid it, and so I never really learned it because everything I heard was a different language. You know, there's 600 official languages in India, and more than that in actuality.
Wow.
So, you know, everybody in northern India speaks some Hindi, but that's only when they're, you know, talking to a government official or watching like national news, and the rest of the time they use their own language. And since I was, you know, like in very rural places and changing zones a lot, I just never learned much. I could, you know, buy food and ask for a place to stay, but definitely couldn't ask for directions really. I mean, I had some phrases that I could ask, but people wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't be able to interpret the answer necessarily or explain to someone that I actually meant what I was asking. That's something we ran into a lot in riding the spine as well. Like, people just couldn't comprehend what we were up to. So if we asked for the road, you know, does this road go to this place? People would say, well, sort of, but the road's super bad. Why would you go that way? The road you want to take is this one, the main road that goes this other direction. And we would have to try to explain that we wanted to ride the really bad road to nowhere, and people just wouldn't get it. And so what we figured out there was that what we needed to do was to ask for directions to the like really small middle of nowhere places that actually were on those roads. And so we would find a map and basically write a list of towns that were in the like blank spaces where we were trying to go. Just like a list of names of like little estancias, little ranches, whatever, any name we saw on the map that was in a blank spot. I would just have a list of them like written on a scrap of paper. And we'd get to a road that, you know, we were trying to take into that zone, because it was always hard to find our way out of more populated areas. Once we got into the middle of nowhere, it was easy enough to like keep going, like bopping along on these like non-trails or whatever, because that's all that was there. But when you're leaving town,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to find them.
Yeah.
So anyway, we would find what we thought it was and then be like, hey, does this road go to Santa Maria or whatever? And people would look at us and be like, why would you go there? And like, well, never mind that. That's where we want to go. And is this the road? And they'd say, kind of shake their head and say, yeah, but it's really bad. And no hay paso. And we would smile and thank them and ride off and, ride for a little ways. And then we'd find ourselves at an intersection with no one to ask and Rochambeau and go from there. But, asking those kinds of questions in a language that you don't really speak is basically meaningless. So I spent a lot of time in India and Nepal, just like completely blind, headed vaguely east, kind of in the mountains, just seeing what happened.
Yeah. It sounds like you enjoy that. I mean, and also, you're doing this for yourself, right? I mean, or is some of this to share with others? Like, is the idea that you're going to do this trip and then you're going to share it?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely for myself. But, the Riding the Spine experience and the reception we had from our blog and how fun it is to look at for me even now, because Jacob did an incredible job. Like, I recommend people out there in internet land to have a look. Like, he wrote really good stories about our trip and took excellent photos. Like, he worked hard to make our blog good. And I don't know anyone who's, we're all a little more aware of what that takes now because everybody's doing that to some extent on their like Instagram or whatever they do. But it's a ton of work to present your experience and present your experience well. And we, went out of our way to like read adventure writing books to try to understand what made good ones good and bad ones bad. And most of them are bad because it's really hard to convey the essence of that any kind of extreme trip, because there's so much like monotony, day-to-day similarity. You can't be like, well, we biked really far today and camped again. And then we saw something beautiful, like nobody wants to hear that. It's like, it's meaningless.
Yeah. And
so you have to figure out what the essence of a like section of time is and group a story around that. So we would try and write, Jacob mostly would write these short stories basically, and then I would edit them and, polish them into really a short story more than like a journal, because journal isn't interesting, but a short story definitely can be. And so we would, only post like once a month or twice a month or something once we like distilled a section into something interesting or meaningful to us, and then we try and share that. But anyway, because of that, all of the journal entries kind of like stand alone as like an interesting story in and of themselves. And the photos, again, we're doing something that like no one else has ever done, definitely at that point, and still not a lot of people are doing. And so that in and of itself is pretty interesting. So yeah, that realizing how cool a website like that or a platform like that can be when you're doing something that's pretty fringe, like what I like to do, inspires me to try and do that myself. So for instance, for this India trip, I made my own blog for that and took a camera for the first time in my life and forced myself to learn to take pictures, try to take pictures and write about it. Inspired in a similar way to Jacob, because I'm like, this is cool and I do want to share it with the world. But, the primary objective is definitely for myself. And as you say, I obviously enjoy the extreme and difficult and unknown. There's, for instance, on that India trip, there was a section where I was on a trail. I knew what the trail was. It was like, somewhere that serious mountaineers and backpacker types go. And I crossed this glacier, mountain pass on my bike, actually met like this German backpacker up there. I think I kind of like blew his mind a little bit because I was, carrying my bike across a glacier at that point.
Yeah.
And, he felt like he was doing something really extreme, which he was. It's like super rugged place to be mountaineering, but he was like, had his GPS on and was like following the route mapped across this glacier with like extreme precision. And I wasn't even sure like which glacier I was on. And, I was like making my own route and I saw this person. I was like, cool, I'm going to go talk to him, make sure I'm on Parang La, which is, the name of this pass that I was trying to be on. So I like left my gear and kind of like jogged half a mile across this glacier to talk to this guy. And he's like, what are you doing over there? There's crevasses, you know. I'm like, the route's over here. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll have to cross the crevasse a few times. Figure I probably will again. And he was just like, what? Anyway, but he confirmed that was the glacier that I meant to be on, and we went our separate ways and had a super gnarly downhill, like basically a full day of downhill to get to a river bottom after that. And then the trail went straight up the other side of the canyon, and I decided to follow the river without knowing anything about the river. And of course, not too far down, I got to a cliff, and it's a pretty interesting, you know, position to be in. Like, hey, okay, I could turn around right now. It's not that far. Right. There's a trail. I know the trail exists. The trail looks hellish for a bike. It doesn't look fun. Following this river does look fun and interesting, but here's a cliff. And like, if I go down this cliff, I might be able to get back up, but I don't know, and maybe not. So I'm committed, right? And so of course, what did I do? I threw my bike off the cliff and jumped in after it because there was a pool to jump into, and my bike was floating there. Yeah. And then, you know, there was some more rideable sections, some more pushable sections, and then I got to a bigger cliff. But at that point, I'm like, well, I maybe could get back up the other one. I definitely can't get up this one, but here we go. And, you know, so I did that a few times, and I made it out, obviously, from having this conversation. I may be the only person who's ever gone down that whole section. I don't know, because it's, you know, pretty remote, rugged, rural. There isn't necessarily a reason to be there, but it was really beautiful and cool. And, you know, biking like in an active glacial river is pretty fun. Fat bikes are amazing. And, you know, I did pop out after that out of town and continued, did my thing. But not long after that, I was on like a yak trail and carried my bike for 10 days. And because it was just that unrideable, which was obviously grueling and unpleasant. And I was second guessing myself at that point. Like, what am I doing? This is stupid. Like, who are you kidding? You can't bike here. Like, why are you doing this? And I got out. I finished that section. Yeah. I got to a road, and I had a map, and I was like, okay, I know where this road goes. I'm gonna follow this road, and like, you know, have some easy riding or whatever. And that's just a more reasonable thing to do. But like, literally within like 2 miles, I saw a dirt road that was on the map that kind of dead ended, but looked like it probably connected through. And like, oh, I'll go that way. And naturally, it did in fact dead end into a cliff, and there wasn't really a way through. So once again, I was rock climbing with my bike, and about halfway up that, I mean, there was kind of a trail, but it was like, you know, very, very steep. Like the Himalaya are really rugged. They're super young mountains. There's a reason that the tallest mountains in the world are all there. That mountaineering there is famous, but also dangerous. It's just like they're unstable and they're incredibly steep. So I'm climbing up like this cliff face like that with my bike. Fortunately, the bike I took in India isn't a long tail, and I have like more backpack or bike packing style gear. So it's a little easier to carry, a little lighter, but it's still a heavily loaded fat bike. And I get about halfway up there, and there's like this little jutting outcrop with a big ass bull yak on it. And he's like, this is my cliff, dude. Like, what are you doing here? And then I'm like, okay, what do I do? Like, obviously I'm not going to I can't go on. This is where the trail goes. Can't fight with this bull yak. Like, this thing weighs like 5 times what I weigh, and this is his terrain, you know? So I just stood there for a while, and eventually he like snorted and ran away and popped out further up the cliff, as if to say, look how easy this is for me. This is my cliff, like whatever. That's how I interpreted it, right? Yeah. But then I sat in this beautiful spot where he'd been hanging out, had lunch, and had this epic view, and was like completely by myself in this totally incredible country where it's pretty hard to be alone because it's so populated. And I just had this like beautiful transcendent experience and was like, okay, just admit it. Like, this is what you want to be doing. It doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah.
You don't even have to be able to explain this to other people, even people who do the kind of thing you do. Like, what I actually do is a little fringe, you know, like even bike packers are like, what are you thinking? Right. But, and I can't necessarily describe it, but it's what I want to be doing. It's just like what feeds my soul. And so I just owned into that point. I'm like, okay, you just carried your bike for 10 days and it sucked, but you're right back at it. And this just feels right. And yeah, that's the closest I can come to answering that question, I guess.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, it's so awesome to hear your stories. And yeah, what's the best way for people to like read about what you're doing and follow along with you?
Yeah, so I mean, the Riding the Spine website, ridingthespine.com, it's still up there. It's definitely worth a visit. It's like so many cool stories. But of course, that's like, 12 years ago now or whatever we finished. I have a blog that I only update when I'm doing something that I reckon is like cool or noteworthy. So I haven't updated it in a while. It's called wandergoat.com, Wandergoat. And that has that India trip. I started it for that. And then it's got a few other, like I did Patagonia with a sweetheart fairly recently. I think maybe I wrote about pack rafting, bike packing in New Zealand on there too. So yeah, whenever I get up to something that I feel like is worth the effort of sharing, that's where I write about it. I used to have Instagram, but I got Insta canceled for some reason recently. I don't actually know why, but
really, you got kicked off?
Yeah, and as far as I know, I wasn't doing anything controversial at all. I was just posting about bike packing. Treehouses, but anyway,
it's the Homeland Security. They're watching you again, apparently.
Something like that, for sure.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat, and super inspiring and really awesome to see what you're up to. So thanks.
Absolutely. So just one thing I want to say, like important message, I think, is that like don't let not having the right gear or the like fear of trying a new thing stop you from checking out, like exploring something you're dreaming about. Like just go do it for a weekend or whatever, like I'm a gearhead. I love gear. I build custom bikes. I'm involved with bike company, Crust bikes. Like it's something I do, but you really don't need the right bike to have fun. You don't need the right bike to bike pack. You don't need the right gear. You can make it. You can get by. You can do it. So just challenge yourself, get out there, have fun. That's the important bit.
Yeah, it's a great message. Super inspiring. Well, we will have links to the sites that Goat mentioned in the show notes. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.